I know I'm crazy. I know I'm a monster. And, people, they look at me and they laugh at me and they tell me how ugly and stupid I am all my life. And I'm looking forward to dying.
Charles Starkweather, a name that would forever be linked to a brutal killing spree that left a lasting mark on American history. At just 19 years old, his actions would lead to his execution in Nebraska's electric chair, but his story began with a trail of deaths that sent shockwaves across the country. In January 1958, Starkweather's violent rampage came to an end, but before his capture, he and his 13-year-old girlfriend, Carol Anne Fugate, had already taken 11 lives. In a matter of weeks, they left a chilling path of destruction. What drove a teenager to commit such acts? Was it blind rage, a need for dominance, or the result of a troubled past? As Starkweather sat in his prison cell, awaiting his final moments, questions about his motives lingered. Was he inherently violent, or were there deeper forces at play? And what about Fugate, the young girl who had been by his side during the crimes? Was she just as guilty, or was she a victim? This documentary will examine the life of Charles Starkweather, the violent events that sealed his fate, and the legal aftermath that followed. Join us as we uncover the chilling facts behind one of the most notorious cases in criminal history. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the upcoming details. We'd also love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd really appreciate it if you could let us know why in the comments. Your feedback helps us understand what you enjoy and how we can make our content even better for you. In 1957, Charles Starkweather's name would become tied to one of the most notorious crime sprees in American history. At just 19 years old, he and his 13-year-old girlfriend, Carol Anne Fugate, embarked on a series of shocking events that left a trail of death and confusion. 11 lives were lost in just a matter of weeks, but the question remains, was Starkweather a cold-blooded killer, or was there something deeper behind his violent actions? And what of Fugate? Was she an accomplice, or was she another victim caught in the chaos? It all started on November 30th, 1957, when Starkweather killed his first victim, a gas station attendant named Robert Calvert. What appeared to be a simple argument quickly escalated into a crime that would set the course for a brutal spree. The reasons for Starkweather's actions were unclear, leaving the public wondering whether his outburst was a result of anger or something more deeply rooted. As the days went on, the murders began to pile up. By January 1958, Starkweather and Fugate had already killed several people, including members of Fugate's own family. His violence grew more intense, but Fugate's role in the events has remained a subject of debate. Was she manipulated by Starkweather, or was she a willing participant in the horrific acts? As law enforcement closed in, the question of Fugate's involvement became more pressing. Was she merely a frightened teenager forced to comply, or did she share in Starkweather's outlook on life? Could she have stopped the killing, or was she trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape? This case continues to spark debate, leaving questions about justice and morality still unresolved. What happened during those dark weeks? The answers may reveal not only who Charles Starkweather was, but also what drives someone to commit such violent acts, and whether Fugate was a victim or a participant. The killing spree began on November 30, 1957, when 19-year-old Charles Starkweather shot and killed Robert Calvert, a 21-year-old gas station attendant. What seemed to be a minor disagreement quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation. It was the first of many, though at the time, no one could foresee the trail of destruction Starkweather would soon leave behind. As Starkweather and his 13-year-old girlfriend, Carol Anne Fugate, continued their escape across Nebraska, the violence escalated. The next victims were Marion Bartlett and Velda Fugate, Carol's mother and stepmother. Though the details surrounding their deaths remain unclear, what was certain was that their killings marked a shift in Starkweather's behavior. The nature of the violence became more personal, yet Fugate's involvement in these killings remained uncertain. Was she forced to comply, or did she actively participate? The couple's violent actions continued with the death of Betty Jean Fugate, Carol's 2-year-old sister. It became evident that Starkweather's motives were not only fueled by desperation, but by a disturbing urge for power. Still, the question lingered: how much control did Fugate have over the situation? Was she merely a frightened witness, or was she complicit in the escalating violence? August Meyer, the 70-year-old man living in a remote area, was murdered next. His killing was part of a growing pattern. Starkweather was no longer acting out of a need for survival. He was now in the midst of a destructive spree. The escalation of the violence was clear. Starkweather and Fugate then moved on to Robert Jensen and Carol King, a couple who was also murdered as part of the spree. Their deaths further cemented the growing pattern of brutality that Starkweather was committing. By now, Fugate's role was becoming the subject of intense scrutiny. Was she coerced, or did she share in Starkweather's actions? Law enforcement and the public were grappling with these questions as the body count mounted. The final victims of the spree were Chester and Clara Ward, a wealthy couple. Starkweather's increasingly erratic behavior left little doubt that the killings were no longer about survival. They had transformed into an unrelenting pursuit of destruction, leaving nothing in their wake but a series of shattered lives. Starkweather's killing spree was not simply a matter of fleeing from the law. As the deaths mounted, the question of Fugate's involvement became even more complicated. Was she an unwilling accomplice, forced into a horrific situation, or had she willingly participated in the destruction alongside Starkweather? This would be the central question of the case as the investigation unfolded. As the manhunt for Charles Starkweather and Carol Anne Fugate unfolded, law enforcement had a breakthrough. A blood-stained car, abandoned in a remote area of Wyoming, became the pivotal piece of evidence that linked them to the crimes. The car, stolen earlier during their spree, was traced back to the couple. Inside, investigators found traces of blood, and other clues pointed to the pair's involvement in a string of murders. This discovery set in motion a coordinated search that brought Starkweather and Fugate into law enforcement's crosshairs. Public fear was mounting. The unsettling string of murders, followed by the realization that the killers were still at large, put pressure on authorities to move swiftly. It wasn't just the violent crimes that caused panic, it was the unpredictability and suddenness with which Starkweather and Fugate moved from one place to the next. Every time authorities thought they were close, the trail would go cold. The investigation saw the involvement of key figures like Sheriff Merle Carnop, Police Chief Robert Ainsley, and Governor Victor Emmanuel Anderson, who ensured all resources were directed toward finding the killers. Their focus intensified as more evidence was gathered. With every new detail, the authorities began to piece together the couple's movements and their escalating violence. Forensic experts worked to confirm the timeline, piecing together details from the blood-stained car, witnesses, and crime scene reports. The forensic findings provided crucial insights into Starkweather's behavior. It became clear that his actions weren't driven by an immediate need for survival, but by a disturbing desire for control and dominance. Fugate's involvement, however, remained murky. Was she coerced, or did she play an active role? Authorities struggled with this question as they examined the evidence in detail. The turning point in the manhunt came when a tip-off led to a high-speed chase in Wyoming. Starkweather and Fugate were spotted driving the stolen car, and law enforcement pursued them through treacherous terrain. The chase was intense, with both fugitives desperately trying to escape, but in the end, law enforcement caught up. Starkweather was apprehended after a tense pursuit, while Fugate was taken into custody soon after. As Starkweather was arrested, he showed little emotion. Fugate, in contrast, appeared withdrawn, offering little insight into the events that had unfolded. With both suspects now in custody, the investigation turned toward understanding the psychological motivations behind the crimes. Law enforcement knew they were dealing with more than just a typical criminal case. It was a complex situation involving a young man who seemed to revel in his ability to outwit the authorities, and a girl whose role in the crimes was still uncertain. With the arrests, the next step was to compile a case that would hold up in court. The forensic evidence, combined with witness statements, paint a chilling picture of how the spree unfolded. But the lingering question of Fugate's participation continued to cast a shadow over the investigation. Was she an unwilling accomplice, or did she actively engage in the murders? That would be a question for the trial, but for now, the authorities were focused on closing the case and bringing the killers to justice. The capture of Starkweather and Fugate marked the end of the manhunt, but it raised even more questions. The investigation had not only unraveled the events of the killings, but had also highlighted the psychological underpinnings of the crime. It was clear that Starkweather was not just a product of his environment. There was something deeper at play. The authorities had a responsibility now, not only to prosecute, but to understand how a young man could become a killer, and what role, if any, Fugate had in the events that shook Nebraska to its core. In contrast to Starkweather's execution, some argue that certain criminals have been unfairly spared due to legal technicalities. Take the case of Ted Bundy, for instance. Although convicted of over 30 murders, Bundy was executed years later after countless delays. Many believe that, had he been executed sooner, justice could have been served more swiftly. This raises a disturbing question. Does the length of time spent on death row diminish the sense of justice, and should the execution of heinous criminals be expedited? Or does the system fail when the process drags on for decades? At 12:04 a.m. on June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather's life came to an end in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. His execution followed months of legal proceedings and intense public interest, bringing closure to the tragic killing spree that had claimed the lives of 11 victims. As Starkweather was strapped into the chair, the tension in the room was palpable, and the weight of his actions hung heavily in the air. In the final moments before his death, Starkweather's last words were brief, yet revealing of his mindset. He uttered, "Dad, I'm not really sorry." His words were chilling in their lack of remorse, a stark contrast to the gravity of the crimes he had committed. These final words reflected a mindset that had remained largely unchanged throughout his trial, a young man who showed little acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. The execution itself was carried out under strict procedure, and once the electrical current was applied, Starkweather's life was extinguished. The event, while swift, drew mixed reactions from the public. For many, the execution marked the end of a long-awaited justice, a fitting punishment for someone who had caused such widespread fear and devastation. Yet for others, the event sparked a larger conversation about the death penalty and its role in modern justice. The moral debate surrounding Starkweather's execution continued to divide the public. Some felt that the brutality of his crimes justified the death penalty, believing that it was an appropriate form of justice for someone who had shown no remorse for the pain he had caused. However, others questioned whether the state should have the power to take a life, especially in a case like Starkweather's, where his troubled past and psychological state had been brought into question. Starkweather's execution, though it ended his life, did little to resolve the moral quandaries that his case raised. It served as a reminder of the complex nature of justice, how the law can sometimes seem to provide clarity while still leaving a legacy of uncertainty and difficult ethical questions. The case of Charles Starkweather and Carol Anne Fugate continues to haunt the American public, not only for the horrific crimes that were committed, but for the larger moral and ethical questions it raises. Starkweather's death in the electric chair in 1959 closed a chapter on the killing spree that took the lives of 11 victims. But even after his execution, the debate surrounding Fugate's role in the murders persists, sparking conversations about justice, punishment, and the limits of responsibility. In 1976, Fugate was released from prison after serving 17 years. Her release reignited debates over her involvement in the crimes. Fugate was maintained her innocence, insisting that she was coerced by Starkweather into participating in the murders. However, the public remains divided. Some view her as a victim, manipulated by a controlling and violent figure, while others argue that her participation makes her just as culpable as Starkweather. The question remains, to what extent should someone be held accountable for actions they were pressured into committing? Fugate's case exemplifies the moral complexities involved in cases of coercion and manipulation.
The case also raised long-standing questions about the death penalty and its application. For some, Starkweather's execution was a necessary response to the violence he had inflicted on innocent victims. The families of the victims and many in the public viewed his death as an act of justice, bringing an end to the suffering he caused. However, others questioned whether the death penalty itself was the right answer. Was killing Starkweather a form of justice, or did it only perpetuate a cycle of violence? These questions about capital punishment continued to spark debate, and Starkweather's case remains one of the most talked about examples in the ongoing discussion about the morality of the death penalty. As Fugate moves on with her life, the legacy of the case endures. The questions it raises about accountability, justice, and the death penalty are just as relevant today. How do we measure responsibility when someone is coerced into violence? How does the justice system determine the appropriate punishment for crimes committed under extreme pressure? And what does Starkweather's case tell us about the limits of human accountability? What are your thoughts on the death penalty? Was Fugate's sentence just? Let us know in the comments below. If you're interested in more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries.